Welcome to Mind Tricks Radio, where we'll explore contemporary topics in psychology through interviewing creative and innovative thinkers in the field. I'm your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan. Thanks for tuning in. Our guest today is Carl Rogers, a visionary psychologist whose work has profoundly shaped our understanding of human nature, therapy, and personal growth. Born in 1902, Dr. Rogers became a pioneering force in psychotherapy, best known as the founder of person-centered therapy, an approach rooted in empathy, authenticity, and unconditional positive regard as the foundation for meaningful change. At a time when psychoanalysis and behavioral conditioning dominated psychotherapy, Dr. Rogers introduced a radically different perspective, that people are inherently capable of self-improvement when provided with the right conditions. His groundbreaking book, Client-Centered Therapy, published in 1951, reshaped the field by placing the individual, not the therapist, at the center of the healing process. He deeply believed in the human capacity for growth and self-actualization, ideas that have since become cornerstones of humanistic psychology. But his influence extended far beyond therapy. His work transformed education, leadership, and conflict resolution, advocating for open communication, deep listening, and respect for personal experience. Today, his ideas continue to shape not just psychotherapy, but also how we think about relationships, learning, and personal development. This episode is the third in a series where I use artificial intelligence to conduct interviews with prominent figures in psychology who have passed away. Of course, the interview is, fictional, since my guests are no longer alive. The voices you'll hear, including that of Dr. Rogers, are artificially generated clones based on their actual voices, and their responses have been created using AI. You may also notice that my own voice in this episode is an AI-generated reproduction of myself. Why not use my real voice? Well, in the spirit of the endeavor, I thought it only fitting to conduct this fabricated conversation with an AI version of me as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this project, what you think of the concept, and any suggestions you might have for future interviews. Before we begin, I want to be clear. This is an AI-generated simulation of Dr. Rogers. This episode is based on publicly available writings, lectures, and research created solely for educational and historical exploration. There is no financial gain, sponsorship, or commercial intent behind this project. It does not represent actual statements, endorsements, or official positions from Dr. Rogers himself, his estate, family, or any affiliated institution. With that said, let's begin our conversation with the legendary Carl Rogers. Dr. Rogers, it's a privilege to have you here today. Your work has shaped the way we think about therapy and human potential.
I appreciate the opportunity to engage in this conversation. I've always felt that real understanding emerges through dialogue, through a process where we remain open to discovery rather than fixed conclusions.
Before we dive in, can you share what initially drew you to psychology, and more specifically, to a more human-centered approach?
Well, my path wasn't exactly a straight one. I first studied agriculture, then considered ministry, but over time I found myself increasingly drawn to the study of human beings. How we grow, how we struggle, how we make sense of our experiences. It was through my work with children and later with adults that I began to sense there was something missing in the traditional approaches to therapy.
What kind of training did you have in the field?
I was trained in the psychoanalytic tradition, which was, at the time, a very structured and directive approach. The therapist's role was largely to interpret the client's experiences, to analyze and explain what was happening beneath the surface. But as I worked with people, I began to feel that the real power for change didn't come from my interpretations. It came from the client's own ability to understand themselves, to make choices that felt authentic and meaningful to them.
It's interesting, many influential psychologists, especially from the 20th century, started their journey with a psychoanalytic background and then veered into new areas of the field.
Well, at that time, psychoanalysis was the only game in town. But over time, like many other folks in the field, I moved toward a different way of working. My direction came to be known as person-centered therapy. Rather than assuming the role of expert, I began to trust more deeply in the individual's own capacity for growth and self-actualization.
What led you to develop this method, and how does it differ from traditional forms of therapy?
I would say the fundamental shift in my thinking was recognizing that people are not broken objects that need to be fixed. They are human beings with an innate drive toward growth, toward becoming more fully themselves.
That would be a more humanistic approach to looking at people.
Exactly. Person-centered therapy is humanistic. In traditional models of therapy, the therapist was positioned as the expert, the one who diagnosed, interpreted, and directed the client toward change. But I began to see that this structure often placed limits on the client's own ability to grow. The more I listened, really listened, to my clients, the more I saw that the most profound changes occurred not when I provided insight, but when they felt fully heard and understood.
So more listening, less talking?
Well, psychoanalysts are good at listening. You know, the old image, people lying on the leather couch talking while the analyst sits behind them with a notepad.
Yes, that's true.
The difference is that person-centered therapy is grounded in the belief that the client is the expert on their own experience. My role as a therapist is not to lead or direct, but to create the kind of relationship in which the client feels safe enough to explore their thoughts and emotions, to process their experiences in a way that is meaningful to them.
Well, psychoanalysts don't necessarily lead or direct either. They are more passive.
Perhaps, but in person-centered therapy, the warmth of the relationship is an important part of healing process. I emphasize the importance of empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. When a person feels truly heard and accepted without fear of judgment, they naturally begin to move toward greater self-understanding and a deeper capacity for change.
Were there any particular experiences or reasons that led to your shift in thinking?
Yes, there were several experiences. One of the most pivotal moments happened early in my career when I was working with children at the Rochester Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children.
Is that in upstate New York?
Yes, for those who don't know, Rochester is in western upstate New York near Lake Ontario. At the time, I had been trained to interpret clients' unconscious conflicts, to analyze their difficulties, and to offer professional insights into the roots of their struggles. But as I worked with these children and their families, I began to notice something. Very often my interpretations did not seem to resonate with them. They would look at me uncertainly, or sometimes they would outright reject what I was offering. What made a difference, I found, was not my ability to analyze their problems, but rather my ability to truly listen, to be present with them in a way that allowed them to feel safe enough to express their own thoughts and emotions. The more I listened, the more I realized that people seemed to find their own answers when they felt understood, rather than when they were given explanations from an external authority.
So the need to be heard and understood was more important to them than figuring out or solving their problems.
Sometimes they had problems to solve. The point is that they were able to take the lead in solving problems when they had the space to do so.
That makes sense. Got it.
Another moment early in my career that had a profound impact on me was when I was working with a client, a young man who had been brought in for therapy, but he hardly spoke. I had been trained in the traditional psychoanalytic approach, so my instinct was to try to interpret, to lead him toward insight. But as I sat with him, I sensed that anything I said would be an intrusion. So I did something I wasn't trained to do. I simply sat with him, quietly, without pressing, without analyzing. And slowly over time, he began to speak. He started to share things that had been deeply buried, things he had never told anyone. And it struck me, he didn't need me to direct him to analyze his words. What he needed was the space to trust his own experience. That was a turning point for me. I realized that real change doesn't happen when the therapist is in control. It happens when the client feels safe enough to explore who they are at their own pace in their own way. That realization led me to develop what became person-centered therapy, an approach that trusts in the client's ability to move toward growth when the right conditions are present. That experience, along with many others, led me to a realization. Therapy was not about applying expert knowledge to the client. It was about providing the kind of relationship in which the client could access their own inner resources. Again and again I saw that when people felt truly heard, accepted, and valued, they naturally moved toward growth and healing. So over time, I found myself moving away from a directive, interpretive approach and toward a way of working that honored the individual's own wisdom and capacity for change. That, I believe, became the foundation of what we now call person-centered therapy.
One of the hallmarks of your approach is the idea that individuals have an inherent tendency towards self-actualization. Can you explain what you mean by that and how it manifests in therapy?
Yes, of course. I have come to believe deeply in what I call the actualizing tendency, the innate drive within each of us to grow, to develop, to move toward becoming the fullest version of ourselves. It's the same natural force that allows a plant to grow toward the sunlight. It's not something imposed from the outside, but rather something within, an inner movement toward greater wholeness and realization.
And this, I imagine, is something that everyone is capable of?
Yes, not only capable of, but a need, a drive toward actualization. In therapy, I have found that if we provide the right conditions, if we create an atmosphere of deep understanding, acceptance, and authenticity, people will naturally move toward greater psychological health. They will begin to process their experiences more fully, to challenge old patterns that may have been limiting them, and ultimately to live in a way that is more congruent with their true selves.
Let's talk about those 3 core conditions for growth in therapy you touched upon earlier. Can you talk about them?
Yes. Empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. In my experience, these 3 qualities create the kind of environment in which real healing and change can occur.
Well, let's talk a bit about empathy.
Empathy is the ability to deeply understand the client's experience from their perspective, to step into their world and to sense what it feels like to be them. It's not about analyzing or offering solutions. It's about being fully present with another person in their struggles and their discoveries.
Well, this might sound like an obvious question, but why is empathy so important?
It's not so obvious. Many forms of psychotherapy do not emphasize empathy in the way it is important to person-centered therapy.
Okay, so tell us a bit about it.
Empathy in the therapeutic relationship offers the client something profoundly rare, the experience of being deeply understood. When a person is struggling, they often feel isolated, as though no one truly grasps what they are going through. Many of us have had the experience of sharing something important with someone only to be met with advice, judgment, or an attempt to fix us. But true empathy is different. It does not try to correct or direct. It simply seeks to understand. In therapy, when I deeply listen to a client, not just to their words, but to the emotions beneath them, and I communicate that I genuinely understand their experience, something important happens. They begin to feel safe. They begin to trust. And in that environment of trust, they can explore parts of themselves they may have been afraid to face.
So it feels really good to feel understood and validated?
Of course it does, but it does more than that from a therapeutic standpoint. Empathy helps clients clarify their own emotions. Sometimes a person does not fully understand what they are feeling until they see it reflected back to them with accuracy and care. When a therapist says, "It sounds like you're feeling deeply frustrated," as though no one really hears you, and the client responds, "Yes, that's exactly it," there's a moment of recognition, of being truly seen. And that recognition is often the first step toward growth.
Is that sort of like the concept of mirroring? Like, for example, when a mother mirrors back to the baby or child what the child is feeling, but doesn't necessarily know how to identify or put words to it?
Yes, that's precisely right. The mother is showing empathy by mirroring the feelings that the child is expressing. I have found that when people feel deeply understood, they begin to accept themselves more fully. And when they accept themselves, they become freer to change. That is why empathy is not just an important technique, it is the very foundation of a healing relationship.
And what about the concept of congruence? Can you tell us about that?
Well, I see congruence as simply being real, being fully present as a genuine person in the room. It means that as a therapist, I don't put on a professional mask or try to appear as someone I'm not. I try to be as open and honest as I can be, both with myself and with my client. If I have a reaction to something the client says, I don't suppress it or pretend it isn't there. Instead, I acknowledge it in a way that keeps the focus on the client's experience while also maintaining honesty in the relationship.
And why is congruence so important to the therapeutic relationship?
I have come to believe that therapy is not just about using certain techniques or following a structured method. It is about creating a real human connection. Clients are very perceptive. Even when they are struggling, they can usually sense whether the therapist is being genuine or just playing a role. If a therapist is distant, overly formal, or trying to appear as though they have all the answers, the client may begin to hold back, afraid to fully share their experience. But if the therapist is present, open, and real, if they are able to acknowledge their own responses with honesty, it creates a different kind of space, one where the client feels safer to be real as well. I have found that when a therapist models authenticity, it gives the client permission to explore their own feelings more deeply. If a client is struggling with self-acceptance, they may feel a strong need to present only the parts of themselves that seem acceptable or safe. But if they see that I, as their therapist, am not hiding behind a professional persona, that I am able to be open and congruent in the relationship, it can encourage them to trust their own experiences more fully.
Doesn't this run the risk of the therapist steering the session in a direction where it becomes about the therapist and not the patient?
Not necessarily. No, it doesn't have to. Congruence is not about directing the client or offering personal opinion. It is about creating a relationship where honesty is welcomed and where the client feels truly seen and understood. When that happens, a deep trust develops. And that trust, I believe, is the foundation of meaningful growth and change.
And finally, how about unconditional positive regard?
Well, I think unconditional positive regard is one of the most powerful elements in any healing relationship. It means accepting the client as they are, without judgment, without conditions. Now, that doesn't mean approving of every action they take or ignoring behaviors that might be harmful to themselves or others. Rather, it means offering a deep and unwavering respect for their worth as a person. I have found that when individuals feel truly accepted, not for who they think they should be, but for who they are, they begin to extend that same acceptance to themselves. And when that happens, real change becomes possible. People begin to explore their experiences more openly without the fear of rejection or evaluation. Often, that's where transformation begins.
Many people became familiar with your approach through the Gloria tapes, where you, Fritz Perls, and Albert Ellis each conducted a therapy session with the same client. Your session stood out for its deep empathy and gentle approach, in contrast to Perls' confrontational style and Ellis's direct challenging of her thinking. What was that experience like for you, and what do you think it revealed about person-centered therapy?
Yes, the Gloria sessions. That was a fascinating experience and one that I've reflected on quite a bit. What struck me most at the time was just how differently each of us related to Gloria. Fritz Perls took a very directive approach, challenging her defenses, pushing her into confrontation. Albert Ellis used a more cognitive, rational approach, trying to help her rethink the way she was viewing herself and her problems. And then there was my session. My intent was not to analyze her or to correct her thinking, but simply to be with her, to listen, to reflect what I was hearing, to help her feel safe enough to to explore what was most important to her in that moment.
Yes, when reflecting on the three experiences, the three sessions with the psychologists, Gloria left your session feeling more understood and more able to trust herself. At least this is what she said in the interviews done with her afterwards.
Yes, that seemed to be her experience. What I think the Gloria tapes revealed is that therapy is not a one-size-fits-all process. Some people may respond well to a more challenging approach, while others may need a space of acceptance before they can engage with change. But for me, what stood out was Gloria's emotional response to feeling deeply understood. At one point, when I simply acknowledged a feeling she had shared, she sighed and said, "Oh, I just felt like you really saw me there." And that moment reaffirmed something I had seen time and time again in my work. When a person feels truly heard, without judgment, without pressure to change, something within them begins to shift. They start to trust themselves more. They begin to explore their experience with greater honesty. So, looking back on the Gloria sessions, I wasn't interested in whether my approach was better or worse than Pearl's or Ellis. What mattered to me was that Gloria left that session feeling more understood, more able to trust herself. And to me, that is the foundation of healing.
Your ideas have influenced not just therapy, but also education, leadership, and even conflict resolution. Can you speak about how the principles of person-centered therapy apply outside the therapy room?
Yes, I have long felt that these principles are not limited to therapy, but are fundamental to the way we relate to one another in all areas of life. In education, for example, I have seen that when teachers approach students with empathy and genuine respect, when they truly listen and encourage self-directed learning, students become more engaged, more confident in their abilities, and more open to growth. In leadership, I have found that when those in positions of authority approach their teams with trust and authenticity, when they listen deeply rather than simply giving orders, organizations tend to thrive. People work more effectively when they feel valued, when they are given the space to contribute in a way that feels meaningful to them.
And what about in conflict resolution?
Yes, similarly in conflict resolution, whether between individuals, groups, or even nations, the ability to listen with empathy and to truly hear another person's experience can be transformative. I have seen that when people feel heard, when they sense that their perspective is understood, even if it is not agreed with, they are often more willing to engage in meaningful dialogue. The principles of deep listening, acceptance, and authenticity create an atmosphere where defenses can soften and understanding can emerge.
And regarding these core principles, empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard, how might one apply them in personal relationships, say with a friend, a family member, or an intimate partner?
That is a thoughtful question because while these principles were originally developed in the context of therapy, I have come to see them as essential in all human relationships. Take empathy, for example. In a personal relationship, empathy means more than just hearing what another person says. It means really trying to understand their experience as they perceive it. Too often when a loved one shares something difficult, our instinct is to offer advice, to try to fix the problem, or to reassure them. But real empathy requires something different. It asks us to set aside our own reactions, our own need to respond, and instead to simply listen, to reflect back what we hear and to try to understand as best we can what it feels like for them. When we do this, when a person truly feels heard and understood, it creates trust and connection. Then there is congruence, or authenticity. In any meaningful relationship, being real with one another is essential. If we suppress our true thoughts and emotions in order to please the other person or avoid discomfort, the relationship becomes strained, even if only subtly. Being congruent means allowing ourselves to be known, to express our feelings in a way that is honest, but also considerate. It is not about being brutally honest or saying everything that comes to mind, but about being genuine. If I say, "This is how I truly feel," rather than saying what I think the other person wants to hear, I am inviting a more honest and open relationship. And then there is unconditional positive regard. This, I believe, is one of the most challenging but most meaningful aspects of a healthy relationship. It means accepting the other person as they are, without conditions. Now, that does not mean that we must approve of every action they take, nor does it mean that we should accept mistreatment. But it does mean valuing them as a person, believing in their worth even when they are struggling, even when they are not at their best. When we can do this for a friend, a partner, or a family member, we create an environment where they feel safe enough to grow.
I can imagine that while these principles sound simple in theory, they can be quite difficult to put into practice, especially since so many people carry experiences of pain, trauma, and defensiveness. Over time, people develop ways of protecting themselves from vulnerability, what the psychoanalytic tradition might call defense mechanisms. What would you say about this in relation to your three core principles and how people might approach them?
That is a very thoughtful question, and I think it speaks to a reality that many of us experience. While empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard are essential elements of a healing relationship, I have found that they are often challenging to practice, both as therapists and as human beings in our everyday relationship. When someone has been hurt, perhaps through rejection, criticism, or betrayal, it makes sense that they would develop ways to protect themselves. They may withdraw, become hesitant to trust, or put up barriers to avoid further pain. And I believe it's important to recognize that these defenses are not something to be criticized. They were, at some point, necessary responses to difficult experiences. They helped that person survive in the best way they knew how. But over time, these same defenses can also prevent them from engaging in deep, meaningful relationships.
I imagine that someone who has been deeply hurt and then uses anger and lashes out at people as a defense mechanism to protect themselves from being hurt again, the anger, it serves a purpose.
That's right, it has a self-protective purpose.
These are sort of like the defense mechanisms we hear so much about in the psychodynamic literature.
Yes, exactly.
At the same time, it could be very unpleasant to be angry all the time and act out, and unpleasant for the therapist as well to be the recipient of the anger.
Yes, and the people around that person, the family, friends, co-workers.
So how would we approach this? How do people get these defenses, so to speak?
Well, I believe it starts with empathy. If we can recognize that a person's defensiveness is not resistance but an attempt at self-protection, we can meet them with patience instead of frustration. Rather than asking, why won't they just open up? We might ask, what in their experience has made it feel unsafe to be vulnerable? When we can approach others with that kind of understanding, without judgment, without pressure, we create a space where they may eventually feel safe enough to begin lowering their guard.
So how does the concept of congruence fit into this picture of interpersonal relationships outside of therapy?
Congruence applies to how we engage with others and also to how we relate to ourselves. If we struggle with vulnerability, the first step is to be honest about it. That might mean saying, I find it difficult to trust, or I feel afraid of being hurt. Congruence does not mean forcing openness before we are ready. It simply means being real with where we are, and when we can do that, it invites others to do the same. And then there is unconditional positive regard, which may be the most difficult of all. It asks us to extend acceptance even when someone is withdrawn, unresponsive, or even pushing us away.
That can be difficult, I imagine, to maintain unconditional positive regard if someone is acting in ways that are difficult, pushing away, angry, shut down, unpleasant.
Yes, but if we can hold the belief that beneath those layers of self-protection is a person who longs to connect, then we can offer something deeply meaningful, the experience of being accepted even when they feel unworthy of it. For example, let's take the person you were talking about earlier, the person who was often angry, lashing out because of her experiences being hurt in her past. How often do you think that person has the experience of being truly heard, accepted, and understood?
Probably not that often, because people are probably on guard around her. They know she is angry, she acts out, she's difficult to be around.
Right, so the experience of being accepted and heard are few and far between. That's where these principles I'm talking about can make a great difference in a person's life, to give them an experience that is unfamiliar to them, but something that everyone longs for deep down.
That makes sense.
None of this is easy. It requires patience, persistence, and perhaps most importantly, the willingness to offer these same principles to ourselves. Many people find it difficult to extend empathy toward their own struggles, to be genuine about their fears, or to accept themselves without conditions. But when we begin to practice these principles in our own lives, we often find that they naturally extend outward into our relationships. If there is one thing I have learned, it is that people open up when they feel truly safe. And safety is not created by demanding vulnerability. It is created by offering understanding, honesty, and acceptance, again and again, until the person is ready. That, I believe, is the foundation of healing, whether in therapy or in life.
Yes, in life. You have spoken about how these principles extend beyond therapy into education, leadership, and even peacemaking efforts. What is your greatest hope for how these ideas continue to shape the world?
That is a question I have thought about often. When I first began working as a psychologist, my focus was on the therapeutic relationship, on creating a space where individuals could feel understood, accepted, and free to grow. But over time I came to see that these same principles, empathy, authenticity, and unconditional positive regard, were not just essential in therapy, they were essential in all human relationships. I have seen these ideas take root in education, where teachers who truly listen to their students, who create a climate of trust and mutual respect, foster a kind of learning that goes beyond rote memorization. When students feel safe to express themselves, to make mistakes without fear of ridicule, they become more engaged, more curious, more willing to take intellectual risks. That, to me, is real education, when learning is not imposed, but discovered within the student themselves. I have also seen these principles make a difference in leadership. When leaders engage in genuine dialogue rather than issuing directives from a place of authority, they build trust. When they value the experiences and perspectives of those they lead, organizations become more creative, more dynamic, and more human. People are far more willing to invest themselves in work when they feel their voices are heard, when they are seen as individuals rather than just employees. And perhaps most profoundly, I have seen these ideas play a role in conflict resolution. I had the opportunity to be involved in peace-building efforts in South Africa and Northern Ireland, where deep divisions and long histories of violence made communication seem nearly impossible. And yet I watched as people who had been raised to see one another as enemies sat down in the same room and simply listened, not to argue, not to debate, but to hear one another's pain, to acknowledge each other's humanity. What I hope more than anything is that this way of relating to one another continues to grow. I believe that if we can create relationships built on these principles, not just in therapy, but in schools, in workplaces, in politics, and in our communities, then real, lasting change is possible. It may sound idealistic, but I have seen it happen. When people feel truly heard, when they are met with understanding rather than judgment, something within them shifts. And when that happens, dialogue becomes possible, healing becomes possible, and perhaps even peace becomes possible.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. I love the optimistic and humanistic view you take on human nature. It's very hopeful. Looking back on your career, what are you most proud of?
I think what brings me the greatest sense of fulfillment is knowing that I may have helped people trust themselves more, to recognize that their own experiences, their own feelings are valid and worthy of exploration. I feel grateful to have played a role in shifting the field of psychology toward a more human, more compassionate approach, one that places trust in the individual's capacity for growth. What has been especially meaningful to me is seeing how these ideas have extended far beyond the therapy room. So many people, therapists, educators, leaders, and even those simply seeking to deepen their relationships, have taken these principles and applied them in ways I could never have imagined. And I hope that in some small way, my work has contributed to making the world a little more understanding, a little more open to the potential within each person.
If you could leave our listeners with one key insight about human nature and growth, what would it be?
I think I would say this: you are enough. You are already in the process of becoming the person you were meant to be. And when you allow yourself to be fully seen, fully understood, and fully accepted by yourself and by others, that is when real growth begins.
Dr. Rogers, it has been an honor to have you here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us and your optimistic message of hope.
Thank you. I've greatly enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for listening to Mind Tricks Radio. I hope you have enjoyed the program. For more information about Mind Tricks, please go to my website, www.waikikihealth.com. Please be sure to subscribe to Mind Tricks podcast and accompanying blog to be notified of new episodes of Mind Tricks. Please be sure to follow Mind Tricks on Facebook by following and liking posts by myself, your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan.